And it seemed like, okay, maybe they won't work it out this month or this year, but sometime soon that's going to happen. In May of 2000, so those talks broke down. May of 2000, Israel pulled all its troops out of South Lebanon. Here, after almost 2 decades, they just overnight, boom, gone, pulled them out. No peace agreement, no deal, but nonetheless, the Israelis were gone from Lebanese territory. The UN came in, marked the border, and said, yes, Israel's gone. So that conflict, although not resolved with a full agreement, also seemed gone. And then Barack, with Bill Clinton, working from the White House, were desperately trying to do a deal with the Palestinians, and we also know what happened in the summer of 2000 at the Camp David, where they got reasonably close, but couldn't bridge some differences and didn't work out. So what we try to show in this book is not just that the past decade has sort of been lost and maybe at some point in the near future you could go back and resume all these, pick up where you left off 10 years ago. Things have changed, and changed in some pretty fundamental ways. And we want to show the way that the psychological and physical landscape has changed. And it will be, and in many ways, it's much more difficult now to do a deal than it was a decade ago. At that time, the notion was if you dealt with a Palestinian leader like Yasser Arafat and you got him to agree, he could keep a lid on the rest of the Palestinians. I mean, that's clearly not the case today. Mahmoud Abbas has very limited authority in the West Bank. He has no authority in the Gaza Strip. So you have this sort of two-headed Palestinian leadership, and how do you work with them? Israel has clearly turned more conservative. The leaders they've been electing have been more conservative leaders, less inclined to make concessions. The settlements, in 1993, when you started the peace talks, there were about 100,000 West Bank settlers. Today, there are more than 300,000. So that settlement issue is still there, but it's 3 times as large. So these problems are not just static problems that you were dealing with back in 1993 or in 2000 or dealing again with today, but they're much larger problems. And so this is one of the points we want to make in the book. And on that note, I'm going to let Jennifer say a few words, and then we'll be happy to take your questions.
So when we were in Jerusalem, I was working for Fox News, and Greg was working for the New York Times. Greg's now with NPR. But the reason we wrote this book is people would say to us, how can you work for Fox and you work for the New York Times and see the conflict the same way? But what we found is that we would find ourselves out covering the same stories actually on a daily basis during those 7 years. And we ended up, if you matched our stories side by side at the end of the day, most of them, they were pretty similar in terms of what we had, the stories we were telling. But the people we met along the way and the characters, and the reason we wrote this book is that we stayed for 7.5 years. I had two daughters born there. They were born at Hadassah Mount Scopus in Jerusalem. When our second daughter was born, it was the eve of the Iraq invasion, and literally as we checked into the hospital, and we write about this in the book, that if Israelis and Palestinians could replicate the peace and the coexistence that occurred in Israeli hospitals between Palestinians and Jews, you would have peace tomorrow. But what was striking to us is that as I gave birth to Amelia, they gave us a little certificate for a gas mask tent for the crib for the baby, and adults were carrying around gas masks on their shoulders at the time because they were worried about Saddam Hussein firing chemical weapons into Israel. But to me, that said so much about the psychology. And there's a line in the book that on the day that we wrote that on the day they're born, Israelis literally begin to prepare for war. And the same could be said about Palestinians. The psychology of both sides is fascinating, and what we try to do is paint the picture of characters on both sides. And the beauty of the Israeli-Palestinian situation, conflict, is that you can cross the front lines in any given day. So as journalists, there are very few wars in the world where you can literally get to both sides and be home by dinner and have both perspectives. So that made it a very exciting place to report from. You may have seen in the Washington Post this morning that there was a story out of Jenin in the West Bank, a very tragic story about Giuliano Myre, who was the 52-year-old son of a famous Israeli theater woman in the theater called Arna. And she became very famous because Jenin, when we were living there, Jenin was a hotbed of radical activity. Because it was at one point in time in March 2002, I think it had produced the most suicide bombers of any place in the West Bank. And we spent a lot of time in Jenin. I went back and forth to Jenin and really documented the rise of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, which was a group that came out of this second intifada. They were more aligned. They were aligned with Fatah and Yasser Arafat. They really emerged as a competitor to Hamas because Hamas was carrying out these dramatic explosions, and the Fatah guys felt like they had been bruised by too much association with Israel and the streets and the Palestinian areas from too many years of being part of the Oslo peace process, which had delivered nothing. And so they needed something radical that could say to the people, we're gonna fight. And the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades emerged. One of the leaders in Jenin of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades was a man by the name of Zachariah Zubeidi. He became, a real thorn in the side of Israel and a very radical guy. He made his name during the famous Jenin invasion when the Israelis, after the Passover massacre, and the Israelis retook the West Bank, and Jenin was a particularly hard-fought battle. There were different versions of what had happened there, but Zachariah Zubeidi became this local, hero of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades. In the book, we describe a chapter where Zachariah Zubeidi, after several years of the Intifada, was as frustrated with Arafat and the Palestinian Authority and declared quite famously that the Intifada had failed. This was extraordinary to come from a leader of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades. But the story comes full circle today as we read about Giuliano Myre because Zachariah had essentially sort of put his weapons aside and gone back to what he had been doing before, which was being part of this theater troupe that this Israeli woman had started in Jenin as a way to get kids off the streets and Palestinian youth from picking up weapons and instead using theater as a way to express themselves so that the anger didn't build up. Giuliano was crossing back and forth into Jenin, had built this, it was called the Freedom Theater with Zachariah Zubeidi, and he was killed on Monday. He was assassinated in the West Bank, and it struck us so much because these were the kind of stories that we came across while we were there, these incredible characters who defied your expectations, defied your stereotypes of Israelis and Palestinians, people who were all involved in one way or another, and often their lives ended in tragedy, and it happened on both sides. And it's why we felt so strongly, and it's why, as journalists, we stayed there so long. Many of our friends who were foreign journalists really only lasted about 3 years, and they would say at the end of it, I don't want to hear about the Israelis and Palestinians. At the end of it, they came away quite frustrated. We came away feeling a great deal of empathy for both sides, and it's the reason we wrote the book. So from that, we will open up the discussion. Greg, do you want to come on up?
Wonderful. Thank you. I'd like you to please wait for the microphone before asking your question, because the Middle East Institute podcasts our programs, and we also film them for YouTube so that we can get a truly global audience. But if you could wait for the microphone, and then if you feel like it, please feel free to say your name and your affiliation. Questions?